Well, good evening. Good to see everybody out this evening. We have recently embarked upon a journey, so to speak, that I know that some of you are also doing, maybe some of you have done in the past, and that is the process of homeschooling our kids. Really want to shout out to you that have homeschooled your kids. I know a lot of mothers here have done that and are doing that. I know that's a lot of work, takes a lot of time and effort, and I appreciate you doing that. Harper's trying to learn to read, and so Kristen's made some flashcards, and I get to do that with her some to try to help her learn some sight words and learn how to read, and it's pretty interesting, and it just reminded me of, you got to start with the basics. We just take for granted that we pick up a book or we pick up a piece of paper and we start reading it and we just fly through it and we just read it and it just comes to us, but you got to learn that, and she's in the process of doing that. And so it just reminded me that if you don't get the very first principles right, then as you go forward, especially in a subject like math, you're going to get the wrong answer every time and it's not going to work. Well, what we've been doing is, on Sunday evenings, we've been going through a series of lessons about foundational principles. And so far, 2 weeks ago, we talked about church history. Last week, we talked about music in worship. We're going to continue that series tonight. And tonight I'm going to try to combine three things, and we're going to try to talk about them at sort of a high level. But we want to talk about the Lord's Supper, giving, and then worshiping on Sunday. Why do we do these things the way that we do them? So that'll be our goal tonight, to continue this foundational principle, these basic things, and talk about these three things tonight. So let's dive right into it. The first one is about the Lord's Supper, and here's how I want to approach it. The question we want to ask is, should we take the Lord's Supper every Sunday? There are several different aspects of the Lord's Supper. We could have a series of lessons just talking about the Lord's Supper and maybe mistakes surrounding the Lord's Supper. But one of the more common questions that we get when you talk to people, maybe you've got friends or family that are members of a denomination, and they talk to you about when they take the Lord's Supper maybe, and you talk to them about, well, we do that every first day of the week. And they may ask, why? Why do you do that? A couple weeks ago, we've got some neighbors that live across the street from us, and they're really nice. We noticed that there's a community church real close to our house, and we noticed there was a lot of people still there one particular Sunday on our way home. And so we asked them, there was a whole lot of people, what was going on? So, well, we took communion Sunday. That's not a norm. That's not the norm practice for them, but whatever frequency they designated, they took the Lord's Supper that Sunday. But we take it every first day of the week. Why do we do that? I looked up on the internet. There's a website. I'm not offering it to you as a good source. There's some very wrong views. I think it's Baptist backed, but it's gotquestions.org. And so I just looked on there, how often should the Lord's Supper or communion be observed? And this is the answer on that website. It says, the Bible nowhere instructs us how often we should take communion. It would seem that, since we take the Lord's Supper to remember Christ's death, we should take it fairly often. Some churches have a monthly Lord's Supper service. Others do it bi-monthly, others weekly. Since the Bible does not give us specific instruction as to frequency, there is some latitude in how often a church should observe the Lord's Supper. I think that's just a pretty common view of a lot of the denominations about when they take the Lord's Supper. Some do it bi-monthly, others weekly. Some just do it once a year. And so maybe this question comes up, why do you do it every week? That seems excessive. I mean, we do it once a quarter, and I think that's plenty enough. I think that's a common view. Well, the Bible doesn't say anything about it, so we just figured we'd take it whenever we felt like was good, and we feel like once a quarter is good. And so let's try to answer that question. In Matthew 26, beginning at verse 26, this is so familiar to us. This is when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. It says, and as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. Then he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. So we know exactly what was being talked about here. Jesus told them exactly what they were doing. This was during Passover, and so they had celebrated that. And Jesus had taken these emblems. He took the cup, and he told them, this is what this is about. This is going to represent my blood. And then he, of course, he took the bread, I said that out of order. He took the bread first, then the cup. But he took the bread, and he told them, "This is my body." There's no doubt what he was talking about and what it symbolized. This is when he instituted the Lord's Supper. What Jesus did not say, though, was, "Now, whenever you take this quarterly, do this in remembrance of me," or whenever you take it monthly or weekly or bi-weekly or any other type of frequency. He didn't say that. And so that one argument that the Bible nowhere says about frequency, we have to grant that it doesn't say, Jesus didn't say, take this once a quarter, once a week, or any frequency. He just told them to take it, told them what it represented. And so, what do we do with that? Well, there's more than just when he instituted it to learn from, of course. And I guess one thing before we go any further, we have to sort of, even though we're doing a Bible basics, we have to sort of assume that everybody understands how to establish Bible authority, and maybe one of the lessons we'll talk about that. But for our purposes tonight, we've got to assume that everybody understands. We do what we do if there's a direct command or statement that tells us to do it, or if there is an approved apostolic example. The apostles did it, God approved of it, so we know that's okay, so we can do it. Or there's a necessary inference, or some have put it an unavoidable conclusion. If we get to that, then we know that we can do it, and we'll be right if we can infer what they did. And so we come to Acts 20 and verse 7, and it says, "Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight." So what's going on here in Acts 20 and verse 7? Paul came to Troas, and he actually made special plans to be there, and he stayed there 7 days. But he made special plans to be there. Notice it says it was the first day of the week. The disciples came together to break bread, and then Paul, he talked till midnight. The joke's always been Paul might have been long-winded. We don't know what time they got started, but Paul delivered a message to them. So it was the first day of the week. They broke bread. Paul delivered a message to them. And so I think we can see here that on the first day of the week, the disciples broke bread. And we use this verse to show that the Lord's Supper was taken on the first day of the week. And the frequency of it was each first day of the week. Every week's got a first day. And that's what they did on the first day. They came together to break bread. There's other verses that mention that. We'll look at one of those when we talk about giving. But that's what they did. The old example, and I sat down and tried to think of a better example. The example that's always used, and it's a good one, so it's tough to change it. But the example is always used is, Friday's payday. You're going to get your check on Friday. If somebody told you that when you started a job, you would know, well, that means I'm going to get paid every Friday. Unless they say bi-weekly or bi-monthly or whatever, you're going to get paid every Friday. We understand that. They don't have to say, well, which Friday? Once a year? I hope not. Once a quarter? That's not great either. We understand that it means the first day of the week, every first day of the week. But while we're here, I want to kind of ask a question and pick this apart a little bit. So the disciples came together to break bread. We have used that verse, and the argument has been maybe against us. How do we know that this breaking of bread was them partaking of the Lord's Supper? And so maybe somebody challenges you on that. Well, that breaking of bread, that was probably just a common meal, and you're trying to use it to show they took the Lord's Supper, but that's probably just a common meal. So how do we answer that? Do you think this is talking about a common meal, breaking bread? Why or why not? Well, again, I would just say from this passage we learned that they were there for that purpose. They came together to break bread. So that was their purpose in being there. We do also understand that this phrase is a figure of speech called an idiom. It's an idiom, break bread. And I'm not an English teacher, so don't even hold me to that. But we use idioms a lot in our everyday language. So for instance, tonight when I get home, start to get tired, I may say, I'm going to hit the sack. That means I'm going to go to sleep. I'm going to go to bed. Or maybe we use an idiom when we're talking to somebody and say, does that ring a bell? And we mean that, not a literal bell ringing. We mean that to say, does that sound familiar to you? So we use, even if you don't know what that word means, we use that in speech pretty often. Breaking bread is an idiom to mean, it could mean eating a common meal. It could mean that. For instance, if you look at Jeremiah 16 and verse 7, it says, nor shall men break bread in mourning for them, to comfort them for the dead, nor shall men give them the cup of consolation to drink for their father or their mother. Jeremiah said, he used the phrase break bread, and here what he was talking about was people were going to stop eating meals because of their deep sorrow, their deep sadness. Men would not break bread in mourning for them. This is talking about a common meal in Jeremiah 16 and verse 7. In the New Testament, in Acts 2 and verse 46, right after on the day of Pentecost, church was established, and it talked about how they stayed there, and it says, continuing daily with one accord in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart. So here in the New Testament, here's an example of this phrase, breaking bread. And this refers to them eating a meal. And we'd say that because daily they were doing these things. Daily they were in the temple and breaking bread. In their houses, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart. We can look at, and I did look at Greek words for food and breaking bread, but I think we can see here this is a common meal. That's what they did. They were together. They did a lot of things. They went to the temple. They broke bread. They were spending time in each other's houses. So even in this verse, that phrase breaking bread is talking about a common meal. And so I think that's where the confusion arises. People talk about the Lord's Supper. It's a meal. It's a memorial meal that's partaken by the disciples to commemorate the Lord's death. And since it's a supper that features breaking of bread, that idiom refers to a common meal, not a common meal, but also it can refer to the Lord's Supper. So that phrase can be used either way. For instance, in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 16, it says, the cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? So here, there's no doubt what Paul was talking about here. When he was talking about this bread being broke, the breaking of bread here was talking about the Lord's Supper. He was talking about the communion. And so there was no doubt here that phrase, breaking of bread, is referring to the Lord's Supper. So it can mean both things, is what I'm saying. And so how do we distinguish it? How do we know in Acts 20 verse 7 what they were doing? Were they eating a common meal, or were they taking of the Lord's Supper? Before we go back there, I want to again point out the fact that we said they were doing this daily. They were eating their food from house to house. They were breaking bread. That phrase there, the context tells us. We can just look around at what was happening, and we can tell by the context that's not talking about the Lord's Supper. And so you look at other verses like Acts 2 and verse 42, and that's right there in the same chapter. It says they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and in prayers. The context there would tell us that that's probably partaking of the Lord's Supper. So they're continuing in the apostles' doctrine, in fellowship, they're all together, they're in prayer, and in the breaking of bread. To me, that would say they are worshiping. Those are actual worship. And the breaking of bread in Acts 2:42 would probably be partaking of the Lord's Supper. And so we circle all the way back to almost where we started in Acts 20 and verse 7. What was going on here? Well, here, this wasn't a daily event like sharing of a meal from house to house. This was the first day of the week. I think that's important that it's pointed out. It's the first day. If it was a common meal, eat a common meal every day. This was the first day. The disciples came together with the purpose of breaking bread, and then Paul spoke to them when they were there. So they met on the first day of the week, which we know they worshiped then. Paul gave them a message. And so we just got to believe the conclusion that we draw is that was the Lord's Supper that they were partaking of. And so that's why we do what we do there. It's interesting if we look at that rest of that passage before we move on. In Acts 20 and verse 7 beginning, I'll read it through verse 11. It says, on the first day of the week when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room when we were gathered, and a young man named Eutychus, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. And being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down and bent over him, and taking him up in his arms, said, do not be alarmed, for his life is in him. And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. Here in this same context, it talks about the disciples came together on the first day of the week to break bread. And then Paul, after This fella, this Eutychus fella, unfortunately, he's remembered for falling asleep and then falling out of a window. And Paul had to go down there and, told them, don't worry, his life is still in him. But right after that, Paul went up and had broken bread and eaten, and then he talked with them a long time. I think this is talking about a common meal. Notice Paul is the only one. Paul is the only one that's mentioned as breaking the bread and eating. When you take the Lord's Supper, all of us do that together. And so, in this same passage, one breaking bread is talking about the Lord's Supper, and the other breaking bread is talking about a common meal. And I think that's pretty interesting. And so, should we take the Lord's Supper every Sunday? Now, just a real quick look at it. Well, that's what they did in the New Testament. They came together on the first day of the week to partake of the Lord's Supper. We don't see them coming together once a quarter mentioning the Lord's Supper, or every other week, or once a year. They came together on the first day of the week. Every week has a first day. And so should we do that? We would say yes. Yes, we should. All right. Let's move on to the second question. The second question is, should we tithe? I told you we'd talk about giving. And I'm kind of approaching these by asking the opposite, or asking a different question. Should we tithe? Maybe people you work with, maybe even your family members talk about the fact that they tithe. And we should do that. But should we? That's the question. I want to kind of go back to the very beginning with the first mention of tithing in the Old Testament. In Genesis 14 in verse 20, it says, "Blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand, and he gave him tithes of all." So here, very first mention, this is when Abraham, on his return from rescuing his nephew Lot, he gave a tenth of the spoils to Melchizedek. And so that word, that's the first mentioning, as far as I know, that's the first mentioning in the Bible of this tithe. The next time we read about it is in Genesis 28, beginning of verse 20. It says, "Jacob vowed a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace. Then shall the Lord be my God, and this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the tenth unto thee." So here, there's another mention of the tenth shall be given of all the blessings that had been received by God. Now, I just want to take a minute to point out that there's no recorded demand of God upon them at this point for a tenth. This was just a voluntary thing where Jacob vowed that he was going to do this. He was going to give a tenth. Well, you go forward and you come to a passage like Leviticus 27 in verse 30. It says, "And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord." So now we get to a point to where God is demanding a tenth of all the produce of the land of Canaan from them. So when the children of Israel became a nation, God made a covenant with them. And that happened on Mount Sinai. And from that point, God demanded a tenth of their things, or this tithe of the land. We're not really going to dive into the whole aspect of tithing. There are several different aspects of tithing at different times. But for our purposes, we're trying to ask, should we do this today? Should we be tithing today? I did a little bit of research, not a whole lot, but I did a little bit of research. And it seems to me that one of the most popular passages for televangelists and other denominational preachers about this is Malachi chapter 3, beginning at verse 8. So I want to read through those. And it says, "Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But you say, In what way have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and try me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such a blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it." All right, so without doing a whole lot of diving into this book of Malachi, or this context here, this is what is used a lot about, again, televangelists and others teaching, you ought to tithe. You need to be given a tenth of everything you've got. Here, they tried to get away with robbing God. They weren't giving him what he was owed and what he was due, and they were being punished for that. I mean, there weren't blessings coming their way because they were robbing God. There's several problems with trying to use this passage for us today, and one of those, not the least of which, is the book of Malachi. As it opens up in Malachi 1 and verse 1, it says, "The burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi." This book was not written for us. This book was written to Israel. The message from Malachi was for them, not for us. Their zeal for God had died out, and he was writing to them to tell them, you're going through some superficial acts of worship, but you're not doing it right. And in this case, in tithing, you're robbing God. Now, you're going through some acts of things, but you're not really doing things the way that God wanted it to be done. And so we can use the theme of the book to apply to us today, but that passage is being perverted for personal gain. You need to tithe, give 10% of what you got. And a lot of times, the religious leaders today are doing it so that they can get rich off of it, and that's a shame. I also read, and I'm not even sure I knew this, but there's a lot of denominational churches today who take a tithe, and that's separate from the offering. So you give 10%, and the so-called pastor of some of these churches gets his pay out of the tithe, and then they take up another offering. And so you got two different collections, I guess, that they're doing. There's no such thing that we find like that in the New Testament. Brent read for us in 1 Corinthians 16, beginning at verse 1. It says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come." There's just one collection in the New Testament. This was supposed to be done on the first day of the week. And when the Christians gathered together, this was one of the things that they were supposed to do. And this is formulated as a command. But the collection is the only source for the church treasury in the New Testament. So all the things that would be spent out of this one collection. And that's what God commanded the church to do in order to take care of all the business or all the affairs that the church would do. And so on the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper. That's what the New Testament tells us to do. Now, the question is, well, how much are we supposed to give then? Because they were supposed to tithe under the Old Testament and give 10%. You remember Jesus in dealing with the Pharisees. I mean, they had it all wrong. They were doing things very wrong, but they were tithing even the smallest of spices and counting out a tenth. And they were wrong because they were putting their traditions on people. And Jesus actually didn't even say anything about their tithing. It was right to tithe under the old law. But for us, so should we be counting out a tenth? What do we do? How much should we give? Well, as you know, in 2 Corinthians 9, beginning of verse 6, Paul said, "But this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver." There's sort of two parts to that. I mean, verse 6 and verse 7 are right there together, but there's sort of two parts of it. So if you take the second part first, how much are we supposed to give? Well, whatever you purpose in your heart, that's what you should give. You shouldn't do it grudgingly or of necessity. And I think we all know what that looks like. I got to give something. So, I'm not happy about it, but I've got to give something. That would be doing it grudgingly or of necessity. And so we ought not do it that way. We ought to be, as he says here at the end, a cheerful giver. God loves a cheerful giver. That's how we ought to look at it. But the first part of this verse is really important too. If you sow sparingly, you'll also reap sparingly. And if you sow bountifully, you'll reap bountifully. And so that's something to keep in mind. God will be pleased with us for our giving if we do so bountifully, if we do so cheerfully, not grudgingly. And so, again, done on the first day of the week, done as we purpose in our heart. And again, that collection is the only source for the New Testament to have collection, this one. And so, how much should you give? Well, you got to determine that, and I've got to determine that, and we've just got to make sure. And I think probably it'd be good for us all to evaluate from time to time. Could I give more? I probably could, and so need to think about that, and I need to be cheerful about it. Think about what those funds are going to and what good is being done because of those funds. So we should give liberally, not sparingly. So should we tithe? Well, here the answer is no, we shouldn't. We don't live under the old law. That's not the law for us today. What we're told to do is to give as we purpose in our heart. All right. What about this last question? So we said we were going to talk about the Lord's Supper, giving, and then worshiping on Sunday. And so we're approaching the last issue this way. Should we be keeping the Sabbath? Every once in a while, I'll get a request at work for somebody that needs to be off Saturday, Friday night from 6 p.m., to the next day, Saturday evening at 6 p.m. And I know just as soon as I get that request, they must be a Sabbath keeper for religious reasons. Typically, we think of maybe the Seventh-day Adventist. I did a quick search on the internet, how many religious groups observe the Sabbath today, and over 50 different groups came up that worship on the Sabbath day, on Saturday. And so again, probably the Seventh-day Adventists come to mind. So should we be keeping the Sabbath? Maybe we're here on the wrong day. Should we be worshiping on Sunday or on Saturday? Well, if you go all the way back to Genesis 2, in verse 3, it says, God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. So all the way back in creation, God rested on the seventh day. And so that makes it a significant day. That's when he ceased his work, his creative work. But actually the Sabbath isn't mentioned till later on. And you get it to Exodus 16. Got a lot of words on the screen here. I apologize. But this is the first real mention of the Sabbath in the Old Testament. In Exodus 16 verse 4 it says, Then said the Lord unto Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my law or no. And it shall come to pass that on the sixth day they shall prepare that which they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. And he said unto them, This is that which the Lord hath said, Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. And Moses said, Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today ye shall not find it in the field. 6 days ye shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none. And it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the seventh day for to gather, and they found none. And the Lord said unto Moses, How long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws? See, for that the Lord hath given you the Sabbath. Therefore he giveth you on the sixth day the bread for 2 days. Abide ye every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day. So the people rested on the seventh day. All right, so the first mention of the Sabbath is here. What's interesting is, you probably noticed as we were reading through that, Moses had to really explain what the Sabbath meant and how to observe it. So you talk to people today that keep the Sabbath, and they will sort of lead you to believe, well, this has always been done this way. But here Moses really had to explain in great detail, and then some didn't get it. Right here it says that some went out on the seventh day to gather, and they found nothing. And so the Lord said to Moses, How long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws? Right there in that section. So they still didn't get it, even after giving that direction, because this was the very beginning of the observance of the Sabbath. Then, of course, we get to the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, beginning at verse 10. It says, Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. So no doubt it's in the 10 Commandments. One of the arguments made is that it was to be established for all mankind forever. And there's several places in the Old Testament to look, but I just want to look at one that I think really clears things up for us. And that's in Exodus 31, beginning at verse 16. It says, Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. All right, so several things to talk about here. I think a person that is a Sabbath keeper would focus on this. It's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. Really focus on that word forever. But I think if we look at the whole thing, so who is the Sabbath for? Well, it's for the children of Israel. The children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, and they shall observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. So it wasn't for us, it was for the children of Israel. It was for their generations. It was a sign between them forever. There's a lot of language used in the Bible that even we use today. there's some verses in the Psalms that talk about maybe the earth. It looks like it would say the earth would stand forever, or this Sabbath would be there forever. We talk like that. Maybe somebody says, "How long have you been here at work?" "I've been here forever. I've been here since the old days." Or, "How long have you lived where you live?" "Oh, we've been out there forever. My family's been out there forever." We don't literally mean forever, but it's been a long time. And that's the notion here. It's going to be a sign between God and the children of Israel. And one of the purposes was, because in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day He rested and was refreshed. So, again, there's several verses that mention the Sabbath given to the Israelites to help them remember. Here it talks about help them remember the creation of the world and the day that God rested. There's another purpose for the Sabbath as well. In Deuteronomy 5 and verse 15, it says, "Remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord thy God brought thee out thence through a mighty hand and by a stretched out arm. Therefore the Lord thy God commanded thee to keep the Sabbath." Here, keeping the Sabbath is associated with the purpose of, was to remind them about their days being enslaved in Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt, the children of Israel were. Slaves didn't get time off. And they weren't allowed to rest. And when God gave them their freedom, He gave them a day of rest to remember that freedom. And that's what's being talked about here. Remember, you were a servant, you were a slave in the land of Egypt. You were brought out by God. Because of that, God commanded to keep the Sabbath day. And so, again, that's sort of another reason for them to keep the Sabbath day. But when we boil it all down, we're not the nation of Israel. We live under another covenant. We weren't enslaved. We weren't slaves in Egypt, and our direct ancestors were not. That happened long ago. But all of that doesn't matter because we live under a different covenant. We are not the Israelites. And so when we ask the question, should we be keeping the Sabbath? No, we shouldn't. We should not be keeping the Sabbath. We read in the New Testament, I'm not going to put the verses back up, but we read in Acts 20 and verse 7, on the first day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread. We read that in 1 Corinthians 16 that it was the first day of the week. It was on Sunday whenever they took the collection. That was the day, the first day of the week, is the day that was set aside for us to worship God. I didn't put any more things on the slide, but you think about why Sunday to worship God. That's the day that Jesus rose from the grave. It was on the day of Pentecost, and that fell on a Sunday. Church was established that day. And again, the Lord's Supper and giving were commanded to be done on that day. And so the first day of the week makes sense for us to worship. We shouldn't be keeping the Sabbath because that was never intended for us. All right, so there you go. There's kind of three combined in one. And we'll continue, Lord willing, next week to talk about some more things. And we're hitting this at a high level. These are basic things that maybe you'll be asked about. Maybe you'll be asked about tithing. Maybe you'll be asked about Sabbath keeping. Maybe you'll be asked about why do we take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week. And hopefully that at least maybe helps you to be able to answer that question. I know it helps me in studying these things. All right, our lesson tonight wasn't talking about trying to convince anybody to obey the gospel. We talked about what we should do as Christians, but if you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, we just urge you to make that decision to be one. If you need to obey the gospel, then why not tonight? Why don't you make that decision? It'd be great to leave here knowing that you're in a good standing with God. If you'd like for us to help you out in that, to study with you, you can obey the gospel tonight. We'd be glad to baptize you into Christ. Maybe you're here tonight and you need the prayers of the church, and we'd be glad to pray for you and with you if that's your desire. If you have a need, come forward while we stand and while we sing.